Ladies and gentlemen, the Brit Pack is back. Show number 30 of the podcast that strives every single week to bring you fighting talk with a distinctly British flavour. My name's Simon Head, and joining me as always is Mr. Chamatkar Sandhu. Now, for those of you out there who listen to the show regularly, you'll probably know, you might have picked it up, that in addition to our love of MMA, we also share a love of professional wrestling. Now, Sandhu, I was up all night watching UFC 209 on Saturday night, and then stupidly repeated the trick last night watching WWE Fastlane. Please tell me you didn't make the same mistake I did, because I am suffering today.
I didn't actually. I actually just finished watching Fastlane about an hour ago. So I kept that aside for my, I suppose, Monday afternoon post-lunch viewing pleasure. I mean, we can go into a whole other podcast about the reaction and review of that particular pay-per-view, as the WWE likes to call it, or special attraction. But yeah, it's tough going sometimes if you're a pro wrestling fan and an MMA fan in the UK or anywhere in Europe really, to keep up and follow along, especially when it's a double-header weekend like it was this past weekend.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, you definitely did the right thing. You definitely did the right thing, holding on and watching it at a more sociable hour. This week's show, we're talking MMA. This is an MMA podcast, and on this week's show, we're going to look back at the aforementioned UFC 209, which promised much as we led into fight week. And as it turned out, it delivered plenty, but I think most people walked away from that event feeling more than a little bit disappointed. We'll explain why that was, and we will also explain why there were plenty of reasons to be cheerful after that event. We will also chat about a very lively press conference that took place on the Friday of fight week over there in Las Vegas, as Britain's own Michael the Count Bisping, UFC middleweight champion Michael Bisping no less, pitched up a little bit late for his press conference, did a Connor, as we like to say in the business, and proceeded to talk trash to the oh-so-polite George St. Pierre. Those two will be getting it on in the octagon, we think probably during International Fight Week. We will talk about that press conference that took place last Friday. We'll also cast our eyes forward to this coming weekend, where the UFC travels down to Fortaleza, Brazil, for UFC Fight Night Belfort versus Gastelum. And we'll also let you know about a huge show that's taking place right here on British soil on Saturday night, as Russian promotion ACB pitches up in Manchester for ACB 54 Supersonic. And I'll tell you a little story about that as well. Sandhu, we've had a busy weekend. UFC 209. We had so much expectation going into this event, and the wheels kind of fell off. We lost the co-main event on weigh-in day, and then the main event just didn't really deliver. We had plenty of other stuff going on, but let's focus on those two stories, because they really were the stories that defined the weekend. Let's talk about the fight that never was, to start with. Khabib Nurmagomedov taking on El Kukui, Tony Ferguson. It was the fight that everyone was absolutely itching to see. The people's main event, whatever you want to call it. And then it didn't happen. Khabib was taken ill. The fight got scrapped. There was no replacement bout. And everyone was left feeling very depressed on Twitter on Friday evening. Where were you when you heard the news, and what was your reaction when you heard about it?
I think I was just coming back home after work actually on Friday, and I was just checking my feed, and obviously, you know, Vegas is about 8 hours behind, and the weigh-ins had, the official weigh-ins had just finished, and Khabib didn't make weight, and he didn't even turn up, and just shortly after that, the announcement was made that the fight was off. And utter deflation is the only way I think I could describe it, because, like you said, Simon, that was the one fight. I mean, you could put that on any card that could headline any card anywhere in the world. For the hardcore MMA community, that is just, it doesn't get any better than that. It really does not get any better than that. And in many people's eyes, you know, Ferguson and Khabib are regarded individually as arguably the best lightweights in the world, you know, although Conor McGregor's got the championship. So that's just how highly rated these two fighters are and were heading into this weekend. So, and this is the third time that the UFC have tried to put this fight together, and once again, it's not come through to fruition, which is just a utter shame, total devastation. What can you say? I mean, will they try to make it again in the future? Who knows? If they do, I think nobody's going to get excited about it until they're both in the octagon and Bruce Buffer's calling out their names, you know? So, yeah, I mean, what can you say? Just really, really disappointed, devastated. I believe Ferguson was paid. Not sure if he was paid his entire show money, but it looks like Dana White said in the post-fight press conference that he was kind of taken care of. Khabib, it looks like, was about 5.5, 6 pounds overweight, which is, that's very, very interesting. And I think there's been lots of conversations, and maybe we can go into this a little bit more about weight classes in general. There's a massive jump from 155 to 170, then 170 to 185. I think there's been lots of chatter, and it's come up again recently. Whether the weight class should be jumping up, in 10 pounds. 155, 165, 175, 185. But at the moment, the way things stand, can you really book Khabib versus Conor McGregor, and risk him potentially coming in overweight or not making weight at all, So I think right now, as things potentially stand, if McGregor's going to come back and defend his lightweight title, Tony Ferguson is in the driving seat because he's on a win streak like Khabib, but he made weight. He acted like a true professional, and I'm not taking anything away from Khabib, and I'm sure there's, some medical issues there. I don't know. Who knows what the issues are? Maybe it's medical. Maybe it's the wrong preparation coming into fight week. But the bottom line is he didn't get it done, and that's going to be an asterisk on him moving forward.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting looking at the different responses from people online when the news came out. I think it was our friend Ken Hathaway actually broke the news. I think he was the first person to mention that the fight was confirmed as being off. There were a lot of people who were obviously very disappointed. I think everyone was very disappointed. I think that goes without saying. Some people were really hammering into Khabib and criticising him for being unprofessional and just not going about his due diligence in terms of making sure he was ready to cut weight and in a position where he didn't have too much to do ahead of the weigh-in. I didn't really like that too much. I think, we don't know what was going on with Khabib on the day. We don't know. He may have had an underlying illness which made the cut just that little bit more difficult. He's a big guy for 155 anyway, it's difficult. And the other thing to bear in mind, he was admitted to the hospital the night before, so that was that sort of early during the weight cut. You're just starting to ramp up the weight cut at that stage, I would imagine. Then get some sleep, having taken most of the weight off, and then you maybe lose the last 5 or 6 pounds in the morning for the weigh-in, with it being early morning weigh-ins. But yeah, we don't know, and we still don't know exactly what happened. And I found some of the criticism of Khabib a little bit premature. I think we need to know the full story before we can really cast judgment on his level of professionalism. What can't be ignored is the fact that Khabib has fights involving Khabib Nurmagomedov have fallen through almost more regularly than the fights have actually gone through, if that makes sense. I mean, you can go on Sherdog and look at a fighter's record, or sometimes you can go on Wikipedia and look at a fighter's record, but that doesn't always highlight the fights that they miss. Tapology is a great website to actually see the story of a fighter's career, because they include the fights that were made and then didn't make it. So it's really interesting looking down that list. He's missed, as you mentioned, Sandhu, he's missed 3 fights with Ferguson. He was obviously hospitalised this past week and couldn't fight this past weekend. Ferguson was injured leading up to the previous fight that they were booked in, which would have been April last year. And he was also due to face Ferguson in the Tough 22 finale way back in December 2015. So that was a rib injury. He's also pulled out of 2 Donald Cowboy Cerrone fights as well. So it's a really difficult one. He's I think McGregor labelled him a serial pullout merchant, and the record suggests that Conor's he's speaking the truth there. So you just hope that Khabib is healthy and okay, and that whatever the problem was, it was just an isolated incident to that particular weekend, and that it's something that he can move on from, because that's a fight I think everybody wants to see.
Yeah.
He's too good a fighter to to be completely drying himself out. If he is struggling at 155, then maybe he does need to look at 170. I don't know how big he'd be as a 170 fighter, but if he can't make 155 safely, then maybe that's what needs to happen. You mentioned Tony Ferguson there, and you say he's in the box seat, and I totally agree with you. What would you do next? I mean, it's kind of an interesting situation in terms of both fighters. You've got Tony Ferguson, who really needed to beat Khabib in order to put himself at the top of the list, and a win over Khabib really would have strengthened his position for a fight with McGregor. He didn't get to fight him, and I know you said that he's jumped him in the queue, and I can't argue with that. He definitely has at this point, but he hasn't furthered his case. He hadn't had the opportunity, so he's almost like a win by default. Do you know what I mean? You know, obviously it's not a win because the actual contest never began, but he now stands above Khabib surely as the top contender in that division without actually having actually done anything to further his claim except for stand on the scales. So what would you do next if you're the UFC with Tony Ferguson, and what would you do next with Khabib?
Right, so this might be a little bit unpopular, but I would actually try and book this fight one more time. And if they're going to do it, I'd want them to do it pretty quickly. Khabib Nurmagomedov does recognize Ramadan. Ramadan starts at the end of May on the 26th, and that will go all the way through until the end of June. And then I'm sure he'll need some time to kind of get back up to usual eating and drinking habits thereafter. And I don't think, Tony Ferguson hasn't fought since last November, and he's in tip-top shape right now. I would say maybe try and rebook this fight on a card, perhaps sometime in May, just to kind of let Khabib, figure out what he needs to figure out. I don't know if that requires someone like a Mike Dolce or someone like that to really monitor him throughout camp, someone who's got a 100% record of every fight that he's taken care of making weight. So that would be a good shout. But at the same time, I would actually, if I'm the UFC and they can do this, I'm sure they can, I'd actually pay Michael Johnson to go through a camp, make weight as a backup. And perhaps this might be something that the UFC can kind of implement into their strategy moving forward, especially when it comes to title fights, is in case one of the two contenders for that championship does miss weight, doesn't make the fight, especially at the last minute. We're talking 24 hours before the fight's supposed to go ahead, which is crazy. But to have somebody who also makes weight and is ready to rock and roll and go the next day. Now, Michael Johnson is someone that was ready to step up on very last minute notice, and was actually on MMA Junkie Radio, and they were trying to get it done, but I think Tony Ferguson wasn't able to agree to the new terms and conditions of it not being a title fight. Obviously, it would have been for less money. But Michael Johnson is somebody that has beaten Tony Ferguson. So if anything, at least then you're A, still contending for an interim lightweight championship, and B, it's against somebody that's already beaten you. So you're able to kind of almost kill two birds with one stone. And at least then, if you're fighting sometime in May, McGregor is supposed to be coming back from his self-imposed exile while he takes care of his missus giving birth, and she's meant to drop the baby sometime in May herself. So timing-wise, that could work out well. Again, this is all in relation to McGregor coming back and defending his lightweight championship and putting the X on any other potential option out there, whether that be in the UFC or elsewhere. But that's what I do. I try and book it one final time and have Michael Johnson pay him to go through a camp and to make weight just in case Khabib falls out at the last minute as a plan B. What do you think?
I think that's a solid plan. I have a similar plan, but it's not exactly the same. I wouldn't make the fight again, but I would put them on the same card. What I would do at this point, I would do Tony Ferguson versus Nate Diaz. That's the fight I would do, because the winner of that, and I would do that for the interim belt, and the winner of that is absolutely the best person to then go on and face McGregor, and also is the most reliable person to go on and face McGregor. So you do the deal for the McGregor fight while you do the deal for that fight. So that there's no messing around with contractual negotiations. You do the deal for two fights. So you do the deal for the Ferguson Diaz fight, and then you then do the deal that if you win, you get this to face McGregor, and then so it's all tied up. There's no messing around. There's no willy won't he after the fact. You lock it in early. That's your main event, if you like. Your co-main event, I think Khabib now needs to prove that he can make 155 pounds. I think just proving he can make 155 pounds isn't enough. I think Ferguson, deserves to fight for an interim title because he should have done before. I think Khabib has a little bit of making up to do. I would do Khabib versus Michael Chiesa on the same card. I think Michael Chiesa, looking down that list of lightweights, and in terms of breaking someone into the championship picture who perhaps isn't already there yet, Chiesa's the most dangerous guy who hasn't really been given a push yet. So I think stylistically that would be a really interesting fight to watch. Khabib and his sort of smash mouth wrestling style against an elite grappler in Michael Chiesa, who is criminally underrated as a UFC lightweight. So that would be my co-main. And the benefit of having that as the co-main is if you have an issue with the main event, obviously one of the two co-main event guys can step up. But I think Ferguson versus Diaz, I think is the fight to make now. I think Khabib had his opportunity there, and for whatever reason it didn't work out. But he has pulled out of, his fights with Tony Ferguson seemed jinxed. We've had three chances of this. I think things need to move before maybe he gets back up there. So that's what I would do. I like your idea just as much, but that's what I would do. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I like either, to be honest with you. I like where your head's at. And again, if you bring Nate Diaz into the equation, A, you've got a proven draw. B, you've got somebody that's got a rivalry with Conor McGregor. And C, if McGregor is going to come back and not do the whole Mayweather thing, and somehow Nate Diaz does win that interim title, then you just got arguably the biggest fight of the year on your hands in that trilogy fight to unify both titles. So yeah, I think either which way, that both options would make a hell of a lot of sense.
I think it's the only realistic fight that you can drag Diaz back in for that doesn't involve Conor as well. I think I can imagine Nate Diaz and Tony Ferguson riffing off each other quite nicely during fight week. They're both sort of no nonsense characters when it comes to dealing with fight week and dealing with the press. I think it would make for an entertaining fight week. I think the fight would be dynamite as well. So, and it also gets Nate back in the picture again, which I think the fans would love to see, irrespective of what Conor McGregor is planning for the rest of the year. That was the co-main event that didn't happen. Let's talk about the main event that did happen, but it didn't really go the way we were hoping. We were both in Madison Square Garden, Sandhu, for the first 5 rounds of Tyron Woodley versus Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. And it was a cagey fight. But it was entertaining. It was intriguing. There was enough action in the fight to keep people on the edge of their seat without it becoming an absolute slugfest. But it was a good fight. This second fight, I think everyone, including, I know I certainly did, I suspect you did as well, were both hopeful that having had a good look at each other for 5 rounds, the inhibitions might not necessarily be there now, and they know that if I just put my foot on the pedal a little bit more in this fight, I can take this guy. As it turned out, the opposite happened. Tyron Woodley spent most of the fight circling and backpedaling around the edge of the octagon. Thompson kind of pushed some sort of pace, but not much, and didn't really pull the trigger again, and was, if anything, more timid than he was in the first fight. How did you score that fight? It was a really tricky fight to watch and a tricky fight to score. If you're going to score the fight, you've got to have your eyes glued to it, and I thought it was a really tricky fight to score. The judges gave it a majority decision to Woodley, 48-47 twice, and one judge scored it a 47-47 draw. How did you score it?
I gave Thompson round 1 10-9.
Yeah.
I gave Thompson round 2 10-9. I gave Woodley round 3 10-9. I gave Thompson round 4 10-9. And I gave Woodley round 5 10-9. So I actually scored it 48-47 in favour of Stephen Thompson. And I'm kind of glad that you mentioned the first fight at Madison Square Garden, because I saw a lot of chatter on Twitter about people calling oh, it's a chess match. I said, no, the first fight was a chess match. That's as close as a quote unquote chess match as you're going to get in MMA. Very, edge of your seat stuff, very cagey. There were a few moments of inactivity even in that fight, but it led to something. It led to moments throughout the fight, which was kind of, very interesting to kind of absorb as the fight was playing out over the course of 25 minutes. This was the opposite. This wasn't a chess match. There was just so much inactivity going on that it kind of asked the question, what are you doing? What are you in there for? You're supposed to be fighting, And I actually thought the referee may have even kind of stepped in and had a word with both of them just for timidity. You know what I mean? But they didn't. Dan Hardy was very kind of, I suppose, blunt with his assessment of the fight, going online, calling it the worst welterweight title fight he's ever seen. I went a little bit further than that, and I've called it the worst title fight in UFC history. The other fight that came to mind at the time was Anderson Silva and Damian Maia, and I haven't seen that fight in quite some time, to be frank. And why would I? But those two fights are 1A and 1B in just terms of lack of fighting. They just weren't fighting. You had a moment in that third round when Woodley took him down and pinned him against the cage on the mat for about a minute or two, and then you had that flurry in the last kind of, let's say, 45 seconds or so, where finally Woodley kind of let loose the guns, and he rocked Thompson. And I thought, John McCarthy was close to stepping in to stop the fight, because it looked like Thompson might have been out there for a second, but it wasn't to be. And I don't know. I mean, I'm calling it the worst title fight in UFC kind of history, Simon. Dan Hardy's calling it the worst title fight in welterweight history. What's your assessment? Is that the worst title fight that you've ever seen?
There's a bit of recency bias in this, obviously, because it's the one that's freshest in the mind. I'm struggling to think of a less exciting title fight, I've got to be honest. The thing that struck me, and I agreed with your scoring, by the way. That's exactly how I scored it. I know some people were suggesting that the last round maybe could have been a 10-8. I don't think so. I think Thompson was winning the round and was winning it relatively clearly. And then Woodley just exploded in the last 25, 30 seconds. And I think even the Nevada Athletic Commission chairman, Bob Bennett, got up in front of the media in a press conference, which is almost unheard of, and said that someone scored it. One of the judges actually scored it a 10-8, and he told him that was an unacceptable score, because you can't have like a 5-point swing in a space of 20 seconds. That's just not feasible. So yeah, no, I thought that was very interesting, and obviously they're scoring using the quotes old scoring criteria. But yeah, no, it wasn't a good fight. It wasn't a good fight. The thing that struck me was Tyron Woodley looked like he was fighting with as someone who was almost scared to lose. Wonderboy Thompson was fighting like someone who almost seemed scared to get hit. He'd been rocked in the first fight. He was being very wary of Woodley's power. I know Woodley was saying he was trying to bait Thompson in and then counter, but really, after 2 or 3 rounds of nothing, you've got to reassess your game plan, and someone needs to say to him, okay, we need to up the work rate here. We need to go for takedowns. You need to take a shot or two in order to get the takedown, but get a takedown early in the round and make that round dominant. And he just wasn't. And it was disappointing, and especially when some of the stuff he was saying pre-fight about, I want to be the greatest welterweight of all time. I am the best welterweight in the world. It's hard to hear those words or read those words back when you know what you just saw in the octagon on Saturday night. Tyron Woodley is capable of way better than that, and I'm sure we will see way better than that. And maybe it's just these two aren't very compatible in terms of their fighting styles. I don't know. But I expect Damian Maia would be relatively cagey himself. So is Woodley going to be any different against someone like him? I don't know. But hugely disappointing fight. I scored it 48-47 for Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. I think Tyron Woodley, and this is only my personal opinion, I think he can count himself very lucky to still be the UFC welterweight champion of the world. Very disappointing main event, and we've spoken about this before. Sometimes you can go to an event and the card can suck almost from top to bottom, but the main event can turn it around for you. This was kind of that in reverse, because as we go down some of these other fights, Sandhu, this card delivered. It actually delivered some really good fights, and some of the most exciting fights we've seen this year. But because of that main event, everyone's gone away on a bit of a downer, and that's a shame, because we saw some great stuff. David Tamer versus Lando Venata. Over to you, Sandy. What a fight! What a fight!
Yeah, and the funny thing is I know that in Vegas, the majority of the media are US based, or certainly North America based media, and I saw a lot of chatter come out throughout Fight Week. A lot of the coverage was centered around Lando Venata being this massive prospect, almost propping him up on a pedestal. This is going to be his star-making performance. And in fact, when this fight got bumped up to... Actually, no, it wasn't bumped up to the main card. The women's strawweight fight was bumped up to the main card. But regards to that fact, there was a lot of kind of hype put behind Venata coming into this fight with Tamor, and kind of like announcing himself on the world stage as kind of the next big thing in the 155-pound division. You and me, clearly on last week's episode, were really, really excited for this particular fight, because covering Tamor as we have on the European circuit, we know what he's capable of. I was fortunate enough to have a gym visit to the All Stars gym a couple of years ago for MMA Junkie, and got to spend an entire day with at the gym with all the fighters there, see them get put through their paces, and Tamor at the time was just coming off the Ultimate Fighter, and he's got a very quirky and interesting personality. I'd say he's very European, to say the least. But I was kind of glad to see some of that personality come through and recognized, especially in the post-fight press conference. With that side, the actual performance was top-notch. One of the most exciting fights I've seen this year. I'd love to see rounds 4 and 5 and 6 maybe somewhere down the road between these two, and I'm sure at some point in the future they will fight again. But what Tamor's done now is he's the one that's announced himself onto the world stage, and the fact that he's able to put a performance like that on a pay-per-view main card is going to do absolute wonders for him moving forward. Now, what's next? You got the Stockholm card coming up around the corner. It's going to be headlined by his colleague at the All Stars gym, Alexander Gustafsson, who's going to fight Glover Teixeira. If I'm the UFC and if Tamor is medically cleared and able to fight on that card, I'd be putting him up maybe a co-main, or maybe at least third on the main card, with another notable, recognizable lightweight, someone ranked in the top 15. So I think now you need to start putting the rocket boosters on Tamor. I think he's got an interesting personality. And I think we've just, hit the tip of the iceberg in terms of, what his personality and his background. His story hasn't been told yet, but in terms of his fighting style, it was end-to-end stuff, very, very exciting. And that's exactly the kind of fight our fans tune in for.
Yeah, cannot agree more. I was excited for this fight because this was much more than a showcase fight for me. I know a lot of people were looking at it, as you said, as a sort of a showcase for Lando, and maybe maybe some of the UFC matchmakers were thinking that. I don't know, but David Tamer he's a warrior, and he's one of those guys who, if you can get in the trenches with him and beat him, your stock is going to go through the roof, because you're going to have to go through an absolute barn burner to do it. But Tamer won all 3 rounds, 30-27 on all 3 scorecards. It was a competitive fight. It wasn't a complete blowout. Let's be clear. They both stood and traded. They both landed some pretty heavy stuff on each other, but Tamer was the one who had the upper hand in all 3 of those rounds. Great performance, as you mentioned, you sort of hinted at the press conference there. He did a little Elvis impression at some point, he's good, and he's got a younger brother who people who know him are telling me that he's even better, and he's a featherweight. So interested to see if maybe he gets his shot. I know during the press conference, David I think he might have even done it in a post-fight interview as well in the cage. Called the UFC out and said, basically, give my little brother a shot in Stockholm, because if you like what you see with me, wait till you've seen him. So you never know. We might see a pair of brothers on the Swedish fight card together. Who knows? That would be pretty spectacular stuff. Love that fight. That was the fight of the night. $50,000 to the pair of them. Much deserved. But there were some strong contenders. We had a couple of huge upsets that preceded that co-main event. Dan Kelly upsetting Rashad Evans, who looked like $1 million. Actually, he was cut like a flipping steak, wasn't he? Did you see the condition of the man when he got into the octagon? He looked phenomenal. He looked like a superhero. He didn't fight like a superhero. He fought like someone who'd been out for a long time and was sort of blowing the cobwebs off a little bit. Dan Kelly did a really good job. It was a close, competitive fight. I scored it for Kelly. The 2 of the 3 judges scored it for Kelly, 29-28 in his favour. The third judge gave it 29-28 for Rashad. Some people are saying Rashad's done. I don't agree with that, Sandhu. Do you think there's still a bit more mileage left on the Rashad Evans clock at 185 pounds, or do you think that perhaps now might be the time to start looking at hanging him up?
Look, can he compete with some of the fighters in the UFC middleweight division? 100%. Can he beat them? 100%. But if you can't beat Dan Kelly on one leg, then you're certainly not ready for the upper echelon of that division. You're certainly not ready for the guys that are contesting for the title. So it depends what Rashad wants to do. He's still a massive name in the UFC. Like I said, he can still do the business. I mean, he didn't get knocked out. He didn't get submitted. He didn't get finished in that fight. It's just he got outpointed, by Dan Kelly. He got the better of him over 15 minutes. But I just don't know where Rashad goes from here. I mean, had he won, I was all ready to kind of put the push behind getting him and Anderson Silva into a fight, which I think would have made a lot of sense, given where they are in their career right now. Both massive marquee names, and they were supposed to fight many years ago anyway, when Rashad was kind of teasing the idea of coming down to middleweight, and it was to try and fight Anderson Silva, but he lost. I don't know what you do with him next in terms of matchmaking, and I guess it's all going to come down to what Rashad wants to do. But if he does fight again and he loses again, it's just going to diminish his legacy a little bit further. It's already taken quite a bit of a pounding, no pun intended, over the last couple of years, given his losses, given some of the injury setbacks that he's had and bits and pieces. So, look, he's already got an analyst gig with Fox. So I'm sure he's going to have a wonderful career after the fight game. I think he needs to assess what he actually wants to do with the time that he has left with the fight game. So I'm not ready to kind of pull the trigger on saying he's completely done. I wouldn't go that far, but I'm just a bit at a loss as to what you do with him next.
Yeah, I wonder whether the UFC might be able to make some use of him for some of the developing market cards. So, for example, they've got a show in Singapore happening later this year, and they're going to put some local talent on those shows, obviously, but to have a marquee name, a former world champion, towards the top of that card, whether it be as a main eventer or a co-main eventer, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think using perhaps an aging former champion who's still got a few miles left on the clock, maybe that's a good spot for him. Maybe use him part ambassadorial but still active, and get him over, maybe fighting in Singapore. I think that would make a lot of sense to me. Word for Dan Kelly, did a great job. The scary thing, Sandhu, is he's actually younger than me. I sort of look at it and go, look at that old man in the octagon, and I'm thinking, yeah, he's younger than me. So yeah, I'm officially completely past it. But no, he did a great job. He did a great job and represented us old cronies very well. Did a good job and got himself a win. Cynthia Calvillo looked excellent with her first round submission over Amanda Cooper. Alistair Overeem and Mark Hunt. We'll talk about that in a second, if we can, Sandy, because we have to talk about the two fights that were in the middle of the preliminary card. Two of the best comebacks you will see in mixed martial arts. And I think if you were going to show somebody who perhaps didn't understand or was looking to understand more about mixed martial arts, why this sport is so great. You could show them these two fights back to back as they happened on the night, and that would be as good an advert for just how quickly fortunes can change, and how you've got to be on your game in so many different areas in order to be a success at the highest level of mixed martial arts. First off, Yuri Alcantara was getting his ass handed to him by Luke Sanders, who looked like $1,000,000. His girlfriend Becky Lynch was in the crowd. I assume it's his girlfriend. Am I right? They are dating, aren't they?
That's the word around the campfire.
Yeah. I was pretty sure they're dating. So WWE Divas champion, or former. Well, no, she's not a diva anymore. She's just a SmackDown champion, or former SmackDown champion, in the crowd cheering on her beau as he was putting on a superb performance against Yuri Alcantara. Looked like Alcantara was finished. He was up against the cage. He was down on one knee. He was shipping an incredible amount of punishment from Sanders' punches, and then for reasons that I don't really understand, Sanders then elected to knee Alcantara in the head. Clearly an illegal knee. Everyone was looking at him going, what are you doing? Referee Mark Goddard, British ref, friend of the show, his reaction was priceless. He stopped the action, pulled Sanders away and looked at him in disbelief and went, what are you doing? What are you doing? It was almost like I was about to stop the fight, and then you need him in the head. What on earth were you thinking of? And ended up taking a point off him. And irony of ironies, that right knee that Sanders planted into the side of Alcantara's head ended up being the knee that Alcantara locked up for a knee bar. And at that point, it's the most nonchalant tap out you'll ever see in the UFC. There was no attempt to fight it. You can't fight a knee bar when it's that deep. And it was almost like he almost shrugged his shoulders and went, yeah, you got me, and tapped out. Incredible comeback, Sandhu. Incredible comeback.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two kind of ways of looking at this fight. I think on the one hand, Yuri was on the receiving end of an uncountable number of significant strikes, unanswered significant strikes. And, could Mark perhaps have stopped the fight potentially at that moment? They weren't, I suppose, the strongest punches to the face or to the head. But I think they were consistent enough where, and a long period of time had passed where Yuri wasn't able to kind of really do anything. But credit to Yuri, he got the time allowed by the referee, Mark Goddard, to be able to kind of, I suppose, wrangle his way out of that situation. And eventually when he got into that situation where he was able to slap on the knee bar, that just goes to show, anything can happen in this sport. Anything can happen, especially when you're as well versed as you are on the ground with jiu-jitsu as Yuri Alcantara is. And I think when the fight had wrapped up, everybody was already kind of, and me personally, I was saying, look, this is probably going to be in line for comeback of the year. Definitely a nomination for comeback of the year. And we've still got the majority, the lion's share of 2017 to get through, but that could very well be the comeback of the year 2017. But then we got on to the next fight, and I'll allow you to set that one up for us, Simon.
Yeah, just very quickly on Alcantara. I think the thing that kept him in the fight, when Goddard was telling him to improve his position or saying you've got to move, he was at least trying to move, and he was responding to Goddard's instructions in there. And I think that is what kept him in the fight. But I don't think there would have been too many more of those punches before Goddard did step in, and it was that knee just completely changed the fight, and it's incredible. And we were saying, I think most people on Twitter, or a lot of people I was seeing, go, what a comeback! That's got to be in line for comeback of the year, and it was certainly so far this year the number one candidate for comeback of the year until the next fight, as you just said, Darren Elkins against Mirsad Bektic. Mirsad Bektic, huge betting favourite going into this fight. Darren Elkins, the biggest underdog on the card. I tweeted out before the fight, basically saying, if you can get in the octagon with Darren Elkins and come out the other side as the winner, then you deserve a top 10 fight. And that's the challenge that Bektic got on his hands tonight. I fully expected him to pass that test. I really did. and Bektic was doing well. He looked like he was winning the fight. He was smashing Elkins to smithereens, particularly with elbows from the from top position. Elkins was a bloody mess quite early on in that fight, but it started to develop that Bektic just kept going to the wrestling, and eventually it became his undoing. And great commentary work from Joe Rogan and Dominic Cruz. They almost foreshadowed this in their commentary. They were explaining why Bektic was doing it, but they also explained how dangerous it was for him to be doing that, because Elkins is a stud on the ground. And eventually Elkins managed to work himself an opening, and huge knockout, rocked him with punches, and then that head kick just sent Bektic crashing to the mat. And the celebration was just primal. It was one of the moments of the year in mixed martial arts so far. And for someone like Darren Elkins, who he doesn't get a lot of shine, but for those of us who cover the sport regularly, when we see his name, you know that you're going to get a teak tough competitor who just leaves everything in the octagon. And you don't go in there with Darren Elkins and come out the other side without knowing you've been in a fight. And Masad Bektic definitely knows that after Saturday night. Incredible performance from Elkins. That, Mr. Sandhu, is the comeback of the year so far. Surely.
I think we'd be hard pressed to see something like that happen again this year. It was just phenomenal. It wasn't just one of the best comebacks that we've seen in MMA. I think it's one of the best comebacks I think we've seen in any combat sport. It was just absolutely phenomenal. I really thought Elkins was just done, absolutely done. His face was absolutely sliced and diced. He was kind of bleeding from all sorts. And actually, again, just trying to dissect the fight as fairly as we can. Is there perhaps a case where the referee could have stopped it? Yes, there definitely is. Is there a case where perhaps Darren Elkins' team and cornermen should be throwing in the towel? Yes, there certainly is, and we just don't see that. Not just in MMA, but in combat sports, we just don't see that enough. Once in a blue moon, you'll see a corner throw in the towel to protect their fighter. But we just don't see that often enough. Now, on the flip side, on the other side of things, it gives fighters like Darren Elkins just the opportunity and the time to come up with a miraculous. I can't get my words out. I can't even get my words out.
Miraculous, remarkable.
Yes. Comeback like that. It was brilliant to see, and the joy in his face, the scream that he gave after Bektic was knocked out when he turned around was beautifully captured. All elbows on Twitter. MMA Fighting, Esther Lynn got a great snap of that, and Darren Elkins. Our good friend John Morgan tweeted he shouldn't have to buy a drink in any bar for the rest of his life, and I'll co-sign that because it was just phenomenal. Is Darren Elkins going to be headlining a pay-per-view anytime soon? No, but he is the type of fighter that really makes you love this sport, and it kind of just shows you the level of athlete, the level of heart, determination, and grit that is within these fighters to be able to do something like that. Just phenomenal. I don't know where Bektic goes from here. I think this will definitely be a lesson learned for him. And I think when he looks back at the tape, he'll see kind of the mistakes he made, and hopefully it'll make him a better fighter moving forward. But I think Darren Elkins has kind of almost cemented his legacy. It's etched in stone now with that kind of comeback.
That's it. It's one of those, like, people will say, where were you when you saw the Darren Elkins fight? It was when you hear the words Darren Elkins, you're going to think of what he did in that fight against Masad Bektic. I don't think anything he does since, and certainly not anything he's done before, I think he's going to stack up against that favourably. I think that is going to be the defining moment of the damage. Darren Elkins, great performance from him. Very, very quickly, Tyson Pedro beat Scotland's Paul Craig on the Fight Pass prelims. Both of them went into that fight as undefeated prospects in the UFC light heavyweight division. Tyson Pedro got the job done, just looked a little bit stronger in the clinch, used his knees really well. Paul Craig will bounce back from this, I am sure. Hopefully we get to see him on a fight card on this side of the pond next time round. and hopefully that defeat doesn't have any negative impact on any potential plans for the UFC to go to Scotland. It was something that was mentioned quite a lot in the build-up to that fight. So fingers crossed we get to see Paul Craig in action again soon, and that he can jump back into the win column. Now, we sort of glossed over the Alistair Overeem-Mark Hunt fight, Sandhu, and I wanted to address that before we move on. Great performance from Overeem. The big question mark for me coming off this fight is what happens now if you're Mark Hunt? Because there was so much tumult leading into this fight. The UFC looked to throw out Mark Hunt's legal case, and that was interestingly timed because that came out during fight week. Which I can't imagine would have been particularly helpful for him as he prepared for the fight. He received a nasty cut to his shin early on in the fight. He thought he'd broken his leg. Turns out reports suggest that he now hasn't broken his leg. He thought he'd broken his tibia, but he hasn't. But Alistair Overeem put on a very, very calm, composed performance and knocked him out with knees. And the man who's so used to face planting his opponents into the mat ended up being the guy who got face planted. What on earth is going to happen next with the Super Samoan?
That's a good question. First of all, I think from Mark's point of view, he's definitely somebody that's going to keep fighting, whether that's within the UFC or not. He's got a big family. He said it before. I think we'll see him fighting for at least a couple of more years yet. Will he get to fight in the UFC? That's the big question. He himself timed his lawsuit quite, strategically after the bout agreement with Alistair Overeem had already been signed. And, obviously he was asked about that. That was a kind of big story concerning this particular fight coming in to last Saturday night in Las Vegas. And, had Mark Hunt won, I was already kind of interested to find out if Joe Rogan was going to proceed with his traditional post-fight interview, given what's going on at the moment with the UFC. So, as it turns out, he lost. Now, he said on his Instagram post, and at the time I think he thought he had broken his tibia, that he'll be back, which I would assume means he wants to be back in the octagon. Will the UFC give him a fight? That's very interesting. If I'm the UFC and I'm the promoter and I've got a fighter that's suing me or my organization, probably not, because all that's going to do is just give more rise to more media attention to kind of the ongoing, battle in the courtroom, so to speak. At the same time, are they in a position where they can actually let him go? Well, probably not, because you have Bellator, or perhaps what might be a better fit for him, Ryzen, out there in Japan, who will be knocking on his door and saying, "Hey, why don't you come fight for us?" So it'll be interesting to see what happens. This was his first fight since last July, since UFC 200. And I think he got paid $750,000 flat. So there's no win bonus anyway. So he got $750,000. And I suppose if you can get that kind of paycheck out of the UFC once, twice this year, great. But I don't know. I'm quite skeptical on him fighting in the UFC again. What do you think, Si?
I am as well. I've got to be honest. There's different ideas in my head with this. I think, in kind of contrast to what you said, I think the UFC, the best route for the UFC is one of two things. Either you release him from his contract, which is what he's asked, and if you release him from his contract, you basically make an agreement where you have an out of court settlement. Part of that settlement involves him being released from the UFC. Problem solved. There's no more legal issues. No more constantly bringing it up. No more disgruntled fighter turning up for fight week. Problem solved. Wash your hands of it. It's done. That's one option. Second option is you keep him around, but you absolutely need to keep booking him in fights, because the last thing you want is to be told you're now actively holding him back because there's pending legal proceedings. He still has to have the ability and the freedom to do his job. So if he's exclusively contracted to the UFC, and all fighters contracted to the UFC are exclusively contracted, then they're duty bound to make fights for him. So the thing that I would probably do is obviously get him off his medical suspension because he'll be medically suspended for a little while, I would imagine. And then book him in a fight as soon as possible. Auckland would be the one. Get him on that Auckland card. No brainer. At the end of the day, the UFC want to sell tickets, and Mark Hunt in the main event in Auckland is a no-brainer. So I think that's the obvious next move for them, unless they want to release him. And you said Rising would be a good fit. Yeah, it would, but it would also probably be quite hypocritical of Mark Hunt to then go and fight in Rising. Because, to the best of my knowledge, there's no drug testing in Rising. It's being run by a lot of the people who are involved in running Pride. There was definitely no drug testing in Pride. It was written into their contracts that people will not be tested for drugs. So, if you want to avoid fighting people who are on performance enhancers, you probably don't want to be fighting in Rising. Bellator, however, might be sort of a happy medium. I certainly think Bellator could use him at heavyweight. You know, they're looking to grow their heavyweight division. Fedor versus Mark Hunt again would be one hell of a fight to put on, and would sort of satisfy the retro leanings of all the old school MMA fans, and would just be an outright exciting fight to watch. So I think Bellator would be the best landing place if he got released by the UFC. But then I think the path of least resistance is if you want to keep him on, is to book him onto that Auckland card. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because if he'd won, then that almost forces the UFC to sort of take him down a particular avenue. The fact that he's lost, you know, everything's up in the air now. I think it's kind of a tossing up process now. Do we keep him, or do we cut our losses and let him go? Interesting times ahead for Mark Hunt. What of Overeem? Because this is a guy who stepped in there. He's had a good run of form, Alistair Overeem. He worked his way up. He's found a new groove in his career. Worked his way up. Earned a title shot against Stipe Miocic. Dropped Stipe Miocic in that fight, and looked like he might be on the way to becoming UFC World Champion and completing the set of championship belts. And then obviously the fight turned on its head. Stipe knocked him out with ground strikes, and then Overeem had to go back to the drawing board. This was the comeback fight. He won it with style points, and he says we're not finished yet. We're not finished yet. He's still got his eyes on that World Championship. Who would you put him in with next?
Well, I think you've got to wait to see the outcome of the Stipe Miocic JDS fight first. I think if JDS wins, then I think you've got a nice little shortcut for Overeem and JDS to do the damn thing again.
Yeah.
You know, you've got a nice little storyline where Overeem's beaten JDS. He wants the title. There's a little history there between the two. So that would work quite well for me personally. I would be happy with that. And although he lost to Stipe Miocic recently, the overall run he's been able to put together over the last couple of years has been very, very impressive. Now, if Miocic wins, then I don't want to see Overeem Miocic again so soon. And in that case, what I'd like to see is Overeem against a Francis Ngannou or a Derek Lewis. Now, if you're going to go the Ngannou route, people might think this might be a little bit too soon for Ngannou, but I think in the heavyweight division, if you've got somebody coming in on a win streak, get him up to that title as soon as possible. You know, let's see what he's got. Let's test him. And they were both cordial about the situation. You know, in the post-fight press conference, they were kind of like hugging and talking to the press together and whatnot. So, and I think Overeem took the call out of Ngannou, and I don't think it was much of a call out, but I think he was answering a question: would you be interested in fighting Overeem? And he said yes, in a flattering kind of way, and out of respect. But how about Overeem and Ngannou on one of our European cards in the second half of this year? You know, there's been talk of perhaps the UFC returning to Rotterdam. I'd love to see an Amsterdam event, but that's just a personal preference of mine. If they're going to go to Rotterdam, why not have Overeem and Ngannou headline that? Two Europeans, one from France, one from Netherlands. That would make a hell of a lot of sense. The other option people brought up was the idea of Derek Lewis. Again, I wouldn't mind that fight at all either. Derek Lewis is on a 6-fight win streak. Unbelievable form. Now he is nursing a broken foot, so I don't know how long that's going to keep him out of work for. And I did, kind of see him say that he wants to take a little bit of time out just to kind of enjoy the fruits of his labor, kind of work on his game a little bit more before he kind of, comes back to the octagon. But if you're going to give me, if you want a pecking order, 1, 2, and 3, if JDS wins, you do the title fight. Number 2, you're doing Ngannou, and number 3, Derek Lewis. That's my kind of preference.
Yeah, I love the idea of the Francis Ngannou fight in Rotterdam. That fight week in Rotterdam last year was one of my favourite fight weeks of the year. Absolutely loved it over there, and would love to go back for another UFC Fight Night show. And over him headlining for the second year in succession, he headlined against Andrei Arlovski that week and knocked him out in pretty spectacular fashion in front of his adoring fans. That would be great. I like the JDS angle as well. I think JDS versus Stipe, by the way, is going to be an absolute barnstormer. So looking forward to see how that one pans out. But the Reem said that he's certainly not finished yet, and I think that performance on Saturday made that very, very clear. And I think if he isn't in a title fight next, I think he's only one win away. I completely agree with you. Really looking forward to see what happens next with British-born Alistair the Reem over him.
Hounslow, by the way, which is literally a stone's throw away from where I live currently in Ealing. Hounslow is. I actually went to college in Hounslow, so there you go.
There you go. You're almost related. That pretty much makes you related, I think. Yeah. So, and if he goes and wins the heavyweight world title, it'll be Brit Alistair Overeem wins the heavyweight championship of the world, maybe. But crazy stuff. Looking forward to seeing what's next for the Reem. Check out his documentary series if you haven't on his website. It's the nuts. It's fantastic. That wraps up UFC 209. Coming up this weekend, we've got UFC Fight Night in Fortaleza, Brazil. Now, not a stellar lineup, but a couple of interesting fights. We'll just whiz through this, Sandhu. Vitor Belfort versus Kelvin Gastelum first off. The old guard versus the new guard. Gastelum now making his home at 185 pounds after a few weighty issues as a welterweight. It looked like $1 million against Tim Kennedy. Will he get the job done against Vitor Belfort on Saturday night? What do you think?
Is the short answer. I think Vitor Belfort's definitely on the tail end of his career. He just can't do it anymore. That may be coinciding with the fact that TRT isn't allowed anymore and is illegal, and he can't get his therapeutic exemption use for it. Make of that what you will. And Kelvin Gastelum, God bless him. Again, we talked about this earlier on. If there was a 165, 175, 185 split between the divisions, 175 would be absolutely perfect for a guy like Kelvin Gastelum, perfect for a guy like Johnny Hendricks. But that's just the way it's set up at the moment. So I've seen a few pictures of him on Instagram, social media, and he looks like he's beefed up quite a bit. So I think he'll be carrying a little bit more muscle. And he's already a very strong and stocky fighter anyway. So he's a powerhouse of a guy. I think he'll get it done, and I think he'll be a finish. Probably first, second round TKO is what I'm expecting of Kelvin Gastelum as he heads into this main event against Vitor Belfort.
Yeah, my money's on a late first round stoppage. I think we'll get the usual hellfire and brimstone from Vitor Belfort in the first 60 to 90 seconds, and if Gastelum can stay out of trouble in that danger period, then I think the gas tank runs dry pretty quick for Vitor Belfort these days. And as we've seen in some of his more recent fights, once he goes off the edge, that's it. There's not much left, and then he's a sitting duck. I think Gastelum gets this one done. Another legend is in action in the co-main event, and it's kind of a similar thing here. You've got Mauricio Shogun Rua, who's been in there with a who's who at 205 pounds. There's John Vellante, who he's looking to move up the 205 pound division. We always talk about the light heavyweights needing fresh blood. Vellante's been around for a while. He's in a great training camp over there with Sarah Longo training alongside his good friend Chris Weidman. This could be a breakout fight for him, but can he get it done against Mauricio Shogun Rua? What do you think?
Not sure. It's a bit of a pick and fight for me, actually, because Rua has shown a bit of form recently. And actually, this plays in nicely to what you were saying earlier on, Simon. It's the UFC using legends in markets that make sense. And obviously, when you go to Brazil, you want to try and get as many of the recognizable figures from Brazil that have obviously had a massive impact on the sport. And Mauricio Shogun Rua is definitely one of them. I'm not sure. I think my head says Volante, perhaps by decision, but I've got a bit of a gut feeling that perhaps Shogun might be able to knock him out, or at least get a TKO finish over him. Volante's kind of alternated between wins and losses recently as well, so he's not exactly showing the best form either. Although, like you said, Simon, he does come from an absolutely fantastic camp. But it's always hard to pick against Brazilians in Brazil. So I'm just going to slightly lean towards Rua in this one.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Volante just because I think there's more upside left for him, and I think if he comes in there in top shape, I think he's got it in him to beat Mauricio Shogun Rua. If Shogun turns up at 100% and really goes for it, then you'd have to side with him. I just think Volante might just have enough. Best fight on this fight card precedes the co-main. Edson Barboza versus Beneil Dariush. That is an absolute cracker of a fight. One of the best grapplers at 155 pounds, who's also developed some fight-ending punch power over his time in the UFC, taking on the single most destructive kicker I think I've ever seen since Mirko Cro Cop. Edson Barboza is an absolute animal. I'm really looking forward to watching this fight. It is a pick'em fight. The styles will clash. I think if Barboza keeps it standing, he pieces him up. But it's going to be a really interesting fight, Sandhu. You going with Barboza for this one, or are you going with Dariush's grappling?
I'm going with Barboza. I think he's got a decent amount of takedown defense, and I think I've seen him. I've seen enough of him now where he's able to kind of wrangle his way out of really awkward situations on the mat from really high level grapplers. So again, it's going to be a very evenly contested fight, I think. But I'm just going to go with Barboza on this one.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that one. They're the three fights at the top of the card. Just to very quickly run down who else we have. Jussier Formiga taking on Ray Borg at flyweight. Betch Correia is back in action on home soil against Marion Renault. And welterweight, Alex Oliveira, the cowboy, taking on Tim Means. That'll be a good fight, kicking off the main card. Also, one to watch out for is the featured preliminary bout, Francisco Trinaldo against Kevin Lee. I think if Kevin Lee wins that one, I would expect him to get a big push from the UFC towards the back end of this year. Godofredo Pepe taking on Karl Bochniak. Sergio Moraes taking on late replacement David Ramos. That'll be an interesting fight. Both of those guys, very, very good grapplers. Michel Prazeres taking on Josh Berkman. And we have 3 Fight Pass prelims. Honey Jason against Jeremy Kennedy. Rani Yahya versus Joe Soto. And the Soldier Boy, the South African, Gareth McClellan taking on Paulo Henrique Costa. That is UFC Fight Night Belfort versus Gastelum. That takes place on Saturday night from Fortaleza, Brazil. That will be live in the UK on BT Sport, most likely BT Sport 2. I have to check the listings for that. And obviously Fight Pass will have the prelims for you if you want those as well. That's our UFC lineup all lined up. Very quickly, Sandhu, just wanted to mention on Saturday we have a big show on British soil, ACB 54. ACB are a rising Russian promotion. They've got some significant backing from a financial perspective, and they've lined up a colossal fight card. I don't know if you've got the fight card in front of you, Sandhu, but 20 fights. 20,
that's a lot of fights, Simon.
Fights. That's madness. But there are some good fights among them, I've got to be honest. The main event sees Luke Barnett, the big slow, big favourite for the Brit Pack, taking on the, I don't know if he's the former KSW champion or the current KSW champion, Mamed Khalidov, who is legit. He's excellent. He's got a 38 fight record and he's got 32 career wins. He's solid, and he's taking on Luke Barnett in that main event. No championship on the line. That's just your main event, so that'll be 3 rounds. Ian Pascu taking on Aslan Beksidov. But there's a load of British talent on this card. Saul Rogers, the hangman, the man who I think we all agree should be in the UFC right now, he's taking on Pat Healy, who not that long ago was knocking on the door of a championship fight himself in the UFC before a failed drug test derailed his UFC career, and he never really came back the same. We've got an all-British clash at at featherweight, as Mike Wilkinson and Brendan Loughnane go head-to-head for the second time. I believe they fought just after the Tough Smashes. They were both on that. That's going to be a good fight to watch. Who else have we got in this fight card? I'm just scrolling down. We've got some decent fight. Nam Fan, if you remember him from his time in the UFC, he's going to face the Hammer, Rob Whiteford, on that card. There's an all-Scottish clash, Chris Bungard and Ian Feenan. Danny Mitchell, the Cheesecake Assassin, is back in action against Andy DeVent, I think he was he ever the Bama champion? I think he might have been the Lonsdale middleweight champion for Bama. Kane Musa is in action. Eden Newton is in action. There's a lot of reasons to check this out on Saturday night. I think they're going to stream it on YouTube, Sandhu. So YouTube or Facebook. So if you haven't got a ticket for the show, it's at the Manchester Arena. I think there's going to be plenty of opportunities to watch it, and you won't need to fork out any money for it. So good news for any MMA fans who want to get some fights in the bank early doors on Saturday before staying up for UFC Fight Night. That is pretty much all we have. I mean, that's a lot of fights. We've got 20 fights coming from Manchester. Oh, one thing I was going to mention. The show, Sandhu, is ACB 54. Yeah. Supersonic. I'll let you into a little secret.
Go on.
That was my idea.
Was it?
I named the show, yeah.
How did that come about? What's the story behind that one then?
There's an English chap who looks after ACB on this side of the pond, and he called me up one day and he said, we need a name for the show, but it can't be to Manchester United or Manchester City. It just needs to have a Manchester connotation, but it needs to be neutral, so it isn't.
Yeah.
And one of the things with ACB is their slogan is less show, more action. And if you've seen any of their shows, they like fight past pacing looks pedestrian compared to how these guys do it. They're literally bringing people in for the next fight as the fighters are leaving the cage from the previous fight. There's literally no turnaround time at all. It's non-stop. So obviously, I said, well, Supersonic's good because it implies sort of pace and speed, which the show's known for. But it's Manchester, it's Oasis, it's Supersonic. And then shortly after that, Oasis brought out their film Supersonic, so it kind of fit that. So so when you see Supersonic on the poster,
who it came from.
Pack listeners can know that came from me, and I'm not BSing you here. That is truth. So there you go. ACB 54 Supersonic, as named by the Brit Pack. So,
well, speaking of Manchester, or that neck of the woods, this should be a nice little segue for you, Simon. Before we kind of go into the Q&A section this week, British UFC middleweight champion Michael Bisping had a press conference with one returning Canadian legend, George Rush St. Pierre. The UFC held a press conference. They announced their fight last week. They held a press conference after the weigh-ins on Friday, and it was definitely newsworthy, to say the least. You had Michael Bisping, who first of all rocked up a little late. He blamed it on the car being at the Wynn versus being at Trist. And, if anyone's been to Vegas, the Wynn and Encore are sister hotels. They look exactly the same. And I've actually been there. I've been in a situation when maybe a cab or an Uber or something has been at the wrong hotel, or I've found myself at the wrong hotel, getting the two confused. But he eventually did rock up, and he came out swinging, Simon. He came out swinging.
He did. Had he had a drink? This is the question. And he was like, GSP accused him of being drunk, and Bisping didn't deny being drunk. He was very croaky, but that's easily attributable to to being on a plane. If he's had to be on a plane, you get that from the aircon or whatever. He might have just been nursing a bit of a cold, but he was pretty fast and loose with the insults, and he was diving in there from a verbal perspective. May he have had a beer, a pre-show cocktail? Possibly, I don't know. But what we did get was plenty combative vernacular from Mr. Bisping. He called him a lizard at one point. He called him a midget at one point. He said he was a great athlete, but he's not a fighter. And I think that's going to be the narrative that runs through the whole thing. Yeah. It's the supreme athlete, George St. Pierre. And he's the guy, Sandhu, when I was working for national newspapers and trying to get people to buy into the UFC, GSP was always the example I used. Because back in the day when he was in his pomp, he was training strength and conditioning with Linford Christie. He was training jiu-jitsu with 10-time ultimate weight world jiu-jitsu champion Roger Gracie. He was training boxing with the great Freddie Roach. He was training wrestling with the Canadian Olympic wrestling team, who invited him to compete at London 2012, even though he'd never wrestled competitively for Canada. And he had to turn that down because of his UFC commitments. And he's got this incredible gymnastic ability as well. And he obviously trains out of TriStar with which is one of the most respected MMA gyms in the world. He's got a little bit of everything, and he's good at everything, and he's got black belts in about 3 or 4 different martial arts. He was the shining example, and he is like, if you're building the perfect mixed martial artist, the closest thing you get in real life is probably George St. Pierre. But he's going to have to get in the trenches with Michael Bisping, and there aren't many people better than the Count when it comes to getting in the trenches, facing adversity, and coming through. We've seen that in his recent fights, and I think it's going to make for a fantastic event. And they haven't announced when it's going to be yet. I think the plan is that it will be probably the headline act, maybe the co-main, in International Fight Week in July in Las Vegas. And I hope that is what happens, and I hope they stack that card, and it gives Bisping the big payday that he's never really had, and that would be the perfect thing for his career. But the press conference just got the juices flowing, Sandhu. I was excited by it. There was plenty going, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, what were your key takeaways from that?
I think the key takeaway for me is the reason this fight is taking place. This isn't Michael Bisping's, I suppose, course of action, course of request. Dana White said that the GSP camp and the people that represent him, when they've been in negotiation with the UFC, and this negotiation has been going on since last October. So, and Bisping has always been in the loop from day one that GSP, if he comes back, he wants a crack at Bisping and he wants a crack at that middleweight title. So any time since October, after the Dan Henderson fight, when you saw Bisping start to make waves with regards to potentially fighting GSP, just know that now looking back in hindsight, that's the fight that was at play. So I think he at the time was just trying to do the best he could to try to create some buzz for it, do his bits and pieces on, and to promote the fight that was potentially around the corner. But people need to remember that this isn't Michael Bisping's request. GSP has brought the fight to the UFC. The UFC have obviously they're in a situation where they need draws. GSP is definitely going to do that for them, and for them, they had to kind of nix the idea of one Yoel Romero fighting Michael Bisping next, and give that opportunity to GSP just to get him back. Get him on the books again, get him headlining a pay-per-view, and that's where we're at now. Dana White said at the press conference that he's going to take care of Yoel Romero financially, so we'll see what happens there. Michael Bisping has also kind of said that he doesn't expect to get a scratch on him in the GSP fight, and he'd be willing to give a pretty quick turnaround and fight Yoel within, I suppose, 6 weeks or so, or 6 or 8 weeks. So he's gone on the record and said that. Of course, we'll still need to find out how the fight plays out before anything can, determine what happens next. But at the bottom line here is, and we go back to the conversation we had last week, and nobody really wants to see divisions get held up, right? You can make the exception here and there. I'm comfortable with this exception in the middleweight division right now. And I go back to everything that you just said, Simon, about George St. Pierre. He, for me, is arguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest of all time, as we currently stand. No PD issues, been a man of integrity, held in very high regard, carried the sport, the UFC, and himself in with the utmost respect in regards to. He's the kind of fighter you can show an example if you've got a 5-6 year old son and daughter who want to perhaps look to somebody of in an inspirational way. He's a perfect example, right? Very clean cut and whatnot. And me personally, I want to see great athletes attempt to achieve greatness. That's what I love seeing. And just for the fact that he's got the cojones to try and jump up a massive weight class. And again, I think this has been a running theme throughout the entire podcast this week. If there was, say, a super welterweight division at a 175 for him to be able to jump into and classify himself as a two-weight champion, that would be, I think, a little bit more reasonable. But he's jumping up big here to 185, and although he's gone on the record and said that you're going to walk around at 190 or close to 200 pounds, that's still, in a weight class where guys are cutting from 200 plus, and Michael Bisping's in that category, And I suppose the most interesting takeaway I took from the press conference with Bisping was basically almost being insulted, that he felt as though GSP thinks that he's an easy fight. And that's why he's been campaigning for this middleweight title fight upon his return to the UFC, right? So I think that was interesting to see Bisping actually come out and say that. And that probably will be the motivation for him going into this camp, is to beat George St. Pierre and say, hey, you're actually a welterweight. How dare you come up to middleweight and think that you could beat me? And on top of that, think that you can jump into a title fight and think it's going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. So I'm all sold now. I'm sold on this fight. And again, I think hopefully the long-term effects of this are not negative. And again, I know that's kind of like everyone's worry, is what does this mean for the UFC and the WME IMG regime? Are we going to start to see fighters jump up and down willy-nilly and titles not get defended properly and as they should? My hope is that that's not what we're going to get. And I think that if GSP is to win the middleweight championship, I still think he's a man of integrity, that he'd at least want to defend it once or twice to give respect to the division he's entering. We won't be able to answer these questions until after the fight. Right now, am I sold on the fight? Yes. Am I looking forward to the fight? Yes. And God bless George St. Pierre for wanting to make a return after 3 years out of the game. And God bless Michael Bisping for accepting it, because that will be the biggest payday of his career. And I think he's gone on the record of saying that the payday will be so high that he could actually look after his family for the rest of his days after this one fight. So I'm all on board for this one.
Yeah, I am. I have to say, if George St. Pierre were to win the title, the thought of him and Yoel Romero would keep me awake at night. That is a terrifying prospect. But no, Michael Bisping versus George St. Pierre, I think it's a fight that makes all the sense in the world. If you look at the fights that GSP could reasonably come back to, I think this is the one that probably makes the most sense all around. If you sort of listed the pros and cons for each option, I think the Bisping fight makes the most sense. We'll get more detail on when it's going to be. I think it'll probably be, as I say, International Fight Week. Yep. I would assume the main event, but who knows? They might have something even bigger planned for the main event, but they like to stack the deck on International Fight Week. I think that'll be UFC 213. I think off the top of my head, it's going to be UFC 213. So stick that date in your diary. That is likely to be the date that we see Michael Bisping take on George Rush St. Pierre. That pretty much wraps up the news and recapping everything for the week. We've got a few questions to run through before we get out of here. So fire away, Mr. Sandhu. Let's get these done.
Absolutely. And we're going to start with Daryl Chumbly, who actually took a screenshot, such as the length of his question. And he says, with all of Woodley's recent comments about the lack of respect from the UFC and fans and not getting money fights, how much damage, in brackets, if any, do you think that the fight has done to his brand and bargaining power with the UFC. I personally think Tyron Woodley's stock couldn't be any lower than it is right now. I don't know, I can't quite put my finger on why he hasn't resonated with fans, perhaps like other fighters have in different weight classes and whatnot. Perhaps you could put that down to his demeanor, some of the things that he said in reaction to fights or asking for fights in the position as a champion. Perhaps you could put it down to the UFC not putting, in his opinion, the promotional hustle and muscle behind him as a champion and his reign. I don't know, but it's quite clear that since he's become champion, he hasn't resonated with the fans that other champions has in the past. And I think, given that performance on Saturday night, when you've got fans in the arena chanting "fight, fight, fight," that's a very, very low, I suppose, and sad state of affairs. I don't know how he's going to bounce back from it. To be honest with you, I think the only way he can potentially bounce back is by fighting the number one true welterweight contender. And it's unfortunate. It's very, very unfortunate. And I still scratch my head at why the UFC did this. They booked Damian Maia and Jorge Masvidal just a week ago. Could they perhaps not have waited a week just to see the outcome of this fight? I think everyone's really behind Damian Maia and the string of wins he's put together in his welterweight division since coming down from middleweight. And, again, he's another Brazilian legend, and he's someone that would give Tyron Woodley, quite a few problems. And credit to Woodley in the post-fight press conference for mentioning Maia as somebody that should be fighting for the title. I think if they book Woodley and Maia next, then great, and maybe just rip up this contract with Masvidal. But as it stands, we're going to have to wait to see the outcome of the Masvidal and Maia fight before we can move forward. And who knows what might get booked in between. Woodley's campaigning for money fights, Simon. So you got Nick Diaz, who's waiting to get off the bench. He's legally available to jump into a fight right now. I don't know, but in regards to the question itself, Simon, in regards to his brand and his stock and where he currently stands within the MMA community and the UFC, where is Tyron Woodley for you right now?
He's not in a good spot. He's not in a good spot. I mean, yes, he's the champion, so we have to remember that he does hold the belt, and nobody's been able to beat him since he's won the belt. So that's a fact that we just need to keep mindful of. But I think he hasn't come across as perhaps the most, I don't know whether it's humble or likable or what it is. Just some of the things he's done and some of the things he said, I think have just rubbed a portion of the fan base the wrong way. I think it all stemmed from when he knocked out Robbie Lawler. There was an opportunity there where everyone was very excited by the fact that Tyron Woodley has just run through Robbie Lawler. It was a remarkable performance. Lawler's known for taking all this punishment and walking through it, and he got absolutely blown out of the water by Tyron Woodley. And pretty much the next thing that Woodley did after that was to go on Fox, split screen with Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, who everybody knew was going to be next. Everybody was waiting for Woodley to say, "Yes, I'm fighting you next. Let's do this," and go from there. And he pulled the switcheroo on him, and he said, "Well, I don't know, maybe I'll try and fight George St. Pierre or Nick Diaz or whatever." And I think that was the beginning of I hesitate to use the word backlash, but I think there is a certain section of the fan base who aren't huge fans of Tyron Woodley, and I think that was the beginning of it. I've got no problem with him. I think he's taking a rather pragmatic approach to things, and fans just like to see people just going in gung ho, and he certainly isn't doing that. So there's that issue as well. It's difficult. You can't say things in one hand and then go out and turn in a performance like he did on Saturday. You can't say, "I'm going to be the greatest of all time," and then you spend 5 rounds running backwards around the edge of the cage against a guy who, if you're the greatest of all time, you should be putting him away, especially when you nearly knocked him out in the first fight. So it's difficult. It's difficult. On paper, Tyron Woodley has everything there to be a star. but there's just something about the way he goes about things that just rubs some people up the wrong way, and it's unfortunate because he's a serious talent. And hopefully, the next fight he gets and the next fight after that will be an opportunity to really see the real Tyron Woodley inside as well as outside the cage. And then hopefully the fans will come round and appreciate him for the athlete that he is.
Sonny Dangel tweets in, and again, Simon, I think just by pure chance, this has turned into a bit of a running theme in today's show. And Sonny tweets in and says, which fighters could be in the 165-pound division?
Oh, blimey.
With Khabib? And he asks Cerrone, ? And who else? I mean, you know what I think would be an amazing scenario, and perhaps one they potentially could do with GSP somewhere down the road. What if you had GSP versus Conor McGregor for a brand new title at 165 pounds? There's no one in that division. It's a brand new weight class. You've got GSP who thinks he can make 155. Well, okay. Well, how about you just make 165, and let's be a little bit careful with that. You've got Conor McGregor who, weighed in at 168 when he fought Nate Diaz. So 165, I think, would be optimal for him. And again, this would perhaps mean him dropping the 155-pound title. So it's not going to be, I suppose, stopping that division from moving forward. And yeah, you've got a division there that you can start to build. You've got so many lightweights that are perhaps a little bit too big for the class. You've got tons of welterweights that are a little bit undersized. But I really, really think that those weight classes should be just rejigged slightly. I really want to see a 165-pound weight class. I think the welterweight division should become 175 pounds, and then you just move forward from there. And then further down the road, you could think about some sort of cruiserweight, weight limit at 195, and you could figure that stuff out later. But I just don't think you've got enough fighters and enough elite level fighters at the weight classes above middleweight. Whereas I think in between lightweight and welterweight, where I believe the bulk and the majority of the fighters in the overall UFC roster reside in, you've got plenty of guys there that can make up a healthy division. Your thoughts on that side?
Yeah, I think what you would have to do, specifically with this weight class, I think you have to be open to fighters competing in more than one weight class at a time, because in the main they've preferred fighters to almost put their cards on the table and say, I'm going to compete in this division or I'm going to compete in that division. If you take a look at the top 15 fighters in the UFC lightweight rankings, I would suggest half of them would probably be happier fighting at 165 pounds. Khabib, Ferguson, Dos Anjos, who has moved up to welterweight, Nate Diaz, Michael Chiesa, Francisco Trinaldo, probably Gilbert Melendez, Al Iaquinta, Will Brooks. All these guys, I think...
Nate Diaz.
Yeah. I mean, all of those guys, I've just reeled off probably 8 or 9 of the top 15 there. And I think all of those guys, if there was an option for them to fight at 165, would fight at 165. Because it's easier for them. But then again, if they're all going to fight at 165, what have you got left at 155? And then you have maybe a few of those guys I mentioned saying, well, maybe I'll stick around at 155. The field's a bit thinner. I can work my way to the top a bit quicker. So I think you need to allow fighters to compete on two fronts when the weight classes are a little bit closer together like this. But I think a 165 weight class would be awesome. I don't know how many welterweights would look to move down. GSP would be one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking through the top 15 now. I mean, they're all big guys, most of them. Masvidal, maybe. Possibly. Maybe not. Cerrone could. Tarek Safadine maybe could. Ellenberger maybe could. But most of them, I think, would struggle to get lower than 170. So I think most of the people you'd see in that 165 division will probably be lightweights moving up rather than welterweights moving down. And I don't have a problem with that. And I think I agree, and we've spoken about this on the show, £10 gap have a £10 restructure, just basically rip up the weight classes, start again. So, right, we're going to start again. And if you're a champion in the current division, we will put you in a title fight for the division above or below if we're going to get rid of your weight class, and do that, and go from there. I think it's safer for the fighters. I also think there needs to be some sort of rule in place whereby fighters are fighting at their optimal weight, are fighting at their natural weight or closer to their natural weight, and aren't having to go through this extreme weight cutting. Even if people have got it down to a fine art and are able to do it, it's still not healthy. It's still not healthy. And I don't know what can be done with that, with all the different athletic commissions and stuff. But that's a whole other can of worms. But yeah, I love the idea of the £10 weight gaps. But I think if you had a 165 division, you could probably take 8 to 10 of the top 15 in the lightweight division. They'd probably all feel more comfortable fighting at 165.
Michael Banner tweets in and says, do you think Thompson and Woodley's pay-per-view stock had dropped since that fight? Well, look, I don't think there was much stock in there in the first place, to be honest with you. They both fought at Madison Square Garden. The reason Woodley's been campaigning for the GSP fight is he wants a big money fight. The reason he was even teasing the fight with Michael Bisping at a catch weight is because he wants a money fight. I think he realizes that, and we'll see what the reports are with regards to how UFC 209 did on pay-per-view, what the numbers are. I don't suspect they're going to be that high. And like I said before, I think his stocks, it hasn't been as low as it is right now anyway. So I think when you do rebook Woodley in a title fight, it's going to have to be a double header. It's going to have to be a co-main event to perhaps a fight that's bigger if he wants to actually cash out and get a big money payday. And obviously Wonder Boy, he's now had 2 cracks, ain't got it done. I don't suspect he's going to be in a title fight anytime soon, so that means he won't be headlining a pay-per-view anytime soon. So that's a non-starter with regards to where his potential drawing ability is in the pay-per-view world. Your assessment of that, Si?
I think the fight on Saturday night was the fight that would have determined their pay-per-view stock moving forward. I think the reason why we're seeing this fight again, it was a rematch that needed to happen from a sporting context. It wasn't a fight that the public were absolutely screaming for, although I think most people knew that it was a fight that made sense.
Yeah,
I don't think people would have been up in arms if they'd have made the Damian Maia fight, for example, instead. I think that, there'd have been some disappointment, but I don't think they'd have kicked off that much about it. I think if this fight had gone a different way and it had turned into an absolute barn burner and someone had emerged victorious after an incredible fight, then you can say, right, they're off and running. They're on their way to becoming a pay-per-view star. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson has got an awful lot going for him, and if he'd have won that fight spectacularly by knockout, you can imagine him getting a real push. It didn't work out that way. Tyron Woodley has got a lot going for him, and you can imagine that if he won that fight spectacularly, he'd have got a fair push as well. But he didn't. He won by the thinnest margin possible. It really is, they're both ground zero in terms of pay-per-view. They really are. And it's going to take, for Woodley, because he's the champion, it's going to take 1 or 2 spectacular performances for people to really start caring about him as a headliner, I think.
Yep, I agree. Final question comes in from Nathan Clapson, who says, who's next for dad bod extraordinaire Dan Kelly? He's 6-1 and calling for a ranked opponent. Would you favour him in any matchup against a top 10 opponent? Well, I'll tell you what, Dan Kelly wants a ranked opponent. Let's have a look at the top 15 of the middleweight division. You got to give him something between 10 and 15. If that's the route you're going to go and give him a ranked opponent, 10 to 15. So here's 10 to 15. So let's number 10 is Kelvin Gastelum, but he's already booked. So let's forget about Gastelum for now. Anyway, let's go from 11 to 15. 11 is Christoph Jotko. 12 is Thales Leites. 13 is Uriah Hall. 14 is Tim Boach. And 15 is Sam Alvey. And these are all according to the official UFC rankings. Simon, I don't know about you, but I'll be down for any of those guys. to face Dan Kelly. And I know there's a card coming up, I believe. Well, there's one in Auckland, which isn't too far from his neck of the woods in Australia. There might probably be another card in Australia later on this year anyway, I would imagine. But I'm happy for any of those chaps to get in there with Dan Kelly. What about you?
Yeah, I'm looking at them, and I can see Uriah Hall piecing him up in the stand-up. I can see Tim Boach knocking him out viciously. I can see Sam Alvey knocking him out, or it not being a good fight. I think there's two fights there that really stand out. The Jotko fight, I think, might be an interesting one. It would be a fight that you could put on in Europe, a little bit closer to home for Dan Kelly in terms of time zone. Would make perhaps a bit more sense for the Australian market. I don't know. This is assuming Auckland isn't doable. I mean, Auckland is obviously the ideal place. I think stylistically, in terms of matching people up, I think the latest fight might be the best. I think you've got a guy whose background is judo against a guy whose background is Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I think that might make for a very interesting matchup. I think I'd worry for Dan Kelly if he ended up in there with Boach or with Uriah Hall. Maybe a bit less so with Alvey, but definitely with Hall and Boach. I think latest and Jotko are probably the two. And if you push me, I'd probably do the latest fight. I think if you can get Tallis latest over to Auckland, I think that would be the fight to make.
And that wraps it up for the Q&A segment, Simon. Thank you, everyone, for tweeting them in. As a reminder, you don't have to wait for us to give you a call to action on Sunday or Monday. Throughout the week, if something pops to your head and you want to ask us, tweet us at the BritPack MMA. I'll give it a like from our account so that you know it's going to get asked on the following week's episode. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. As well as the BritPack MMA on Twitter, you can follow Sandhu at Sandhu MMA, and you can follow me at Simon Head. Our website is thebritpackmma.com. You will find everything you need there. But there are other ways of getting the show. You can obviously stream it live directly from the website. You can get it via SoundCloud, you can get it via iTunes, you can get it via Stitcher, and you can get it via Acast. So if you've got any of those apps, you can subscribe to the show through those and get those on your mobile device, no problem at all. That was show number 30 of the Brit Pack. Enjoyed that one. We have UFC Fight Night for Fortaleza this weekend. We have ACB 54 in Manchester this weekend. We will come back with news of both on next week's show, where we look ahead to the big one, UFC Fight Night in London, as Jimmy the Poster Boy Manoa looks to pick up another big win in that light heavyweight division when he takes on Corey Overtime Anderson in the main event. Until then, enjoy the fights, and we'll speak to you next week.